Ever felt like you're always the one chasing, waiting, or wondering where you stand with the emotionally unavailable guy? What if I told you that women between 30 and 40 hold an untapped power most don't even realize, one that makes even the most avoidant man lean in, crave closeness, and work for you? Today, I'll give you the 3 things high-value women do, not to manipulate, but to command respect, desire, and deep emotional investment from even the most avoidant partners. Emotional detachment is often mistaken for strength. It's that instinct to pull back, act indifferent, not care too much, not show too much, and definitely not feel too much. Women in their 30s to 40s, especially those who've been through the ringer, heartbreaks, toxic dynamics, emotionally unavailable partners, often adopt this armor of detachment, believing it protects them. They tell themselves that if they don't care, they won't get hurt. If they don't lean in, they won't fall. And if they don't fall, then no one gets to disappoint them again. But here's the twist. Detachment doesn't give you power. It robs you of connection. It doesn't elevate you above the avoidance games. It places you right in the middle of them. Only now you're playing defense instead of offense. It's like building a wall so high that even the right person wouldn't dare to climb it. What looks like strength on the outside is often just fear in disguise. What actually makes a woman powerful, what shifts the dynamic with an avoidant, is emotional clarity. The kind of clarity that says, this is what I want, this is what I don't tolerate, this is how I show up in relationships, and this is the standard I hold myself to. Clarity is knowing the difference between someone needing space and someone stringing you along. It's the ability to sit across from someone and read their patterns, not just their words. It's seeing through excuses without needing to call them out every time. It's that quiet strength that comes from self-trust, not from trying to appear unfazed, but from being deeply in touch with what you deserve. Because clarity doesn't just help you spot the avoidant, it makes the avoidant confront himself. When a woman is clear, emotionally clear, she doesn't need to test a man to see if he cares. She doesn't need to make dramatic exits or sudden silences to feel in control. She doesn't ask where the relationship is going every other week because she knows what she's looking for and she watches if his actions align. That's it. There's no over-explaining, no begging for reassurance, no bending over backwards to maintain a connection that's one-sided. She's not afraid to be vulnerable because her clarity protects her more than any walls ever could. Vulnerability, when backed by self-awareness, becomes a strength, not a weakness. It says, I can show you who I am without fearing I'll lose myself in the process. And that's what rattles the avoidant. They're used to emotional chaos, to partners who chase, who question themselves, who internalize the avoidance inconsistency. But when they meet a woman who responds to distance with grounded certainty instead of anxious pursuit, they feel it. It's unnerving at first because the game doesn't work on her. He pulls away and she doesn't collapse. He gets quiet and she doesn't fill the space with desperate energy. She notices, she feels it, but she doesn't panic. She stays with herself. That's emotional clarity. That's the shift. She's not afraid of being alone, not because she's emotionally detached, but because she's emotionally equipped. She knows that being alone isn't the worst thing. Being with someone who makes her feel alone, that's the thing she'll never settle for again. And let's be real, this kind of clarity doesn't come overnight. It comes from lessons, from patterns she's recognized in herself and others. It comes from doing the inner work, not just reading the books or listening to advice, but really looking at her own attachment style, her own triggers, her own beliefs around love and worthiness. It comes from choosing herself, not in a trendy self-love way, but in the deep, uncomfortable moments when she says no to someone who almost meets the mark but still doesn't make her feel safe, seen, or valued. That's when the avoidant begins to feel something he's not used to, accountability. Because he realizes that this woman doesn't just want love. She expects it in a form that's real, consistent, and emotionally available. And that expectation, that inner calm, that's what shifts the dynamic. It's not in the texts she sends or the ones she withholds. It's not in how quickly she replies or how long she waits. It's in how she carries herself, in how she responds rather than reacts, in how she walks away when things stop aligning with her peace. Avoidants get a bad reputation for being cold, emotionless, or commitment phobic, but that's not entirely accurate. What many people misunderstand is that avoidants aren't incapable of love or intimacy. They're often just overwhelmed by the pressure that comes with it. When someone leans in too quickly or too hard, their default response is to pull back, not because they don't care, but because closeness triggers discomfort. It makes them feel like they're about to lose control. And when they feel that loss of control, they retreat to the only space that feels safe, their distance. The issue isn't that they don't want intimacy. The issue is that intimacy feels unsafe when it comes too fast or too intensely, especially if it demands something they're not ready to give. And that's the key. Avoidants aren't driven away by connection itself. They're driven away by pressure. A woman in her 30s or 40s who has done the work begins to understand this, not just intellectually, but experientially. She starts to see that chasing an avoidant, pressing for clarity, or asking for more time, more words, more presence actually pushes him further away. Not because she's wrong for wanting those things, but because of how and when she's asking for them. When she's still trying to control the outcome or get ahead of the emotional curve, it turns into pressure. And avoidants don't respond to pressure with intimacy. They respond with silence, withdrawal, and deflection. So she shifts. She learns not to ask more of someone than they are clearly willing to give, not to prove her worth to someone who's unsure, not to plead for connection from someone who fears it. She steps back not to play games, but to stop exhausting herself in a dynamic that feeds anxiety and confusion. There's a moment when a woman realizes that the avoidant isn't rejecting her. He's rejecting the discomfort he feels when emotional expectations start to close in. The more she tries to create closeness by pulling on him, the more he feels like he's losing himself. So she stops trying to pull. Instead, she stays still. She lets him feel the space. Not as punishment, but as a natural result of her refusal to shrink or chase. This woman doesn't smother, but she doesn't disappear either. She maintains presence without pressure. She allows room for connection to grow on its own timeline, not one built on anxiety or insecurity. And that's when something unexpected happens. The avoidant stops running. Because what he's used to, emotional intensity, unspoken expectations, or guilt-laced needs, isn't there anymore. What's there instead is calm, is space, is choice. When a woman lives with that understanding, her energy shifts. She's not trying to force a relationship into becoming something it's not ready to be. She's not pushing for emotional declarations before they're earned. She's not constantly checking in to make sure he still wants her. She's observing. She's reading the moment. She's aware of what she brings to the table, and she lets the relationship reveal itself. That lack of pressure doesn't mean she has low standards. It means she's rooted. She doesn't push because she doesn't need to. She's not afraid of losing him because she knows that if someone needs to be chased to stay, they were never really present in the first place. Avoidants often operate from a place of emotional protection. They've been conditioned, consciously or not, to fear engulfment, to associate closeness with responsibility or loss of identity. So when they meet someone who gives them emotional space without emotional punishment, it changes the game. That space allows them to breathe, to think, to feel, to choose. And that choice is everything. Because when an avoidant chooses connection without being cornered into it, that connection is real. It's not a product of guilt, coercion, or need. It's a product of desire when it's born in safety, becomes sustainable. This woman understands that emotional pacing is powerful. She's not in a rush to lock things down just to feel secure. She lets the connection deepen at its own rhythm, trusting that what's real will hold. She knows how to be emotionally open without being emotionally heavy. She knows how to share without oversharing, how to care without clinging, how to connect without consuming. She meets the avoidant where he is, but she doesn't stay there. She extends presence, not pressure. She leads with patience, not panic. And in doing so, she invites a level of emotional safety that even the avoidant didn't know he was craving. There's a distinct difference between setting a boundary and issuing an ultimatum, and a woman in her 30s or 40s who's grown through enough relational experience knows this difference in her bones. She no longer throws out threats like, if you don't do this, I'm gone, just to provoke a reaction. She's not interested in manipulating outcomes or getting her way through emotional pressure. She's not trying to scare someone into loving her better. What she does instead is establish clear, non-negotiable standards that she lives by, whether someone else meets them or not. She's not posturing. She's simply honoring herself. She's not demanding change. She's inviting alignment. And in doing so, she becomes a woman who commands deep respect, even from the most avoidant men. Avoidants are highly sensitive to control. The moment they feel boxed in, they retreat. They interpret pressure as danger and react by putting distance between themselves and whatever they perceive as a threat to their autonomy. That's why ultimatums rarely work with them. They don't respond to force. They respond to freedom. And that's where the power of boundaries comes in. A boundary doesn't say, you have to do this. It says, this is what I allow in my life. There's no begging, no blame, no emotional outbursts, just quiet certainty. A woman who leads with boundaries knows that her peace is not up for negotiation. She's not emotionally flailing to get someone to choose her. She's already chosen herself. When an avoidant meets a woman like this, it disrupts his pattern. He's used to one of two extremes: people who chase after his attention and people who withdraw in bitterness. He's not used to someone calmly holding her ground, communicating clearly and refusing to settle, not with drama, but with dignity. She doesn't need to yell. She doesn't need to threaten. And she definitely doesn't need to compete. She simply holds her line. If a man steps over it, she doesn't punish him. She repositions herself. She exits the space where her value isn't being mirrored, and she doesn't do it to prove a point. She does it because that's just who she is now. This kind of woman knows that consistency is more important than chemistry, that safety matters more than sparks, that emotional maturity is sexier than mixed signals. So she builds her life around alignment, not attraction alone. She's not waiting for the avoidant to turn into someone else. She's observing who he is, how he shows up, and what that says about his capacity to meet her where she is. If he steps forward with effort, she opens. If he pulls back, she doesn't chase. Her boundaries don't bend every time she feels lonely or hopeful. They're rooted in self-respect, not self-protection. Ken, what makes this so powerful is that it turns the avoidant's usual game inside out. He can't manipulate her with silence because she doesn't feed it with over-explanation. He can't control the pace with unpredictability because she's not anchored in his behavior, she's anchored in her values. She's not waiting for him to define the relationship. She's already defined what kind of relationship she will and won't entertain. That clarity, something the avoidant isn't prepared for. It draws him in, not out. Because there's a strange paradox in human behavior. When we are given freedom, we often respond with commitment, not the kind that's forced or faked, but the kind that's chosen from a place of genuine desire. And that desire grows when someone feels safe, respected, and free to step forward at their own pace. This woman doesn't need to convince anyone of her worth. Her presence already speaks for her. She communicates her expectations once, clearly and calmly. She doesn't repeat herself. She doesn't beg for change. She simply pays attention to whether her needs are being met and makes adjustments accordingly. This creates a dynamic where the avoidant is left with only two choices: rise to meet her or retreat. And here's what's interesting. Many do rise, because when someone is no longer being pulled or pushed, when the pressure is removed but the standard remains, it forces them to reflect. Not because someone is telling them to do better, but because they've encountered someone who won't settle for less, no matter how strong the connection feels. This woman becomes a mirror. She shows the avoidant not what they should do, but what is required to stay in her life. That mirror can be confronting. It can stir fear, resistance, even denial. But it also opens the door for real growth if the man is ready, and if he's not, she's already at peace with that too, because her boundaries aren't reactive, they're rooted. They're not about controlling someone else. They're about protecting the emotional environment she chooses to live in. Desire doesn't grow in suffocation, it grows in space. And that's something a woman in her 30s to 40s begins to understand, not just as a concept, but as a lived truth. She's been through the stage where she thought closeness meant constant contact, where she believed that love was proven by how often someone called, how quickly they texted back, or how much time they spent together. But now, with more emotional maturity and self-awareness, she recognizes that real desire isn't created by filling every moment. It's created by allowing room to breathe, to miss, to reflect. And that's especially true when dealing with an avoidant man, because the more he feels engulfed, the less space he has to feel anything at all. Avoidants are sensitive to emotional intensity, especially when it feels like it's closing in on them. They're often not comfortable being the object of someone else's need, especially when it's expressed in ways that feel urgent, heavy, or constant. They start to associate closeness with responsibility, with pressure, with losing their sense of independence. So when a woman shows up and doesn't flood the space with expectations, when she doesn't need constant reassurance or validation, it confuses him in the best possible way. She's not trying to prove her value by always being present. She's not keeping the connection alive by force. She's letting it breathe. And in that breath, he starts to feel something unexpected. He starts to feel her absence, not as abandonment, but as mystery, not as punishment, but as contrast. This space isn't about playing games. It's not silence meant to manipulate or distance used to punish. It's intentional. It's about allowing the emotional energy to shift from pursuit to reflection. She's not using silence as a weapon. She's simply not interrupting the process. She knows that when someone is uncertain or emotionally avoidant, more words, more closeness, and more effort often push them further away. So instead of trying to close the gap, she honors it. She lets the space do what words can't. She doesn't fill the silence with anxious texts. She doesn't try to decode his behavior in real time. She steps back, not in fear, but in wisdom, because she understands that absence, when paired with presence, creates longing, and longing is the birthplace of desire. This doesn't mean she disappears or becomes emotionally unavailable. It means she knows when to lean in and when to lean back. She knows how to be present without being overwhelming. She knows how to maintain connection without casing it. That balance is rare. It's what makes her so compelling. The avoidant, used to partners either over-pursuing or withdrawing completely, now finds himself in a situation where he has space, but also warmth. He has freedom, but also a sense of emotional safety. And that unique balance begins to shift his internal resistance. He doesn't feel cornered. He doesn't feel smothered. For once, He feels like he can choose intimacy rather than defend himself from it. When she gives space, it's not cold, it's grounded. Can, she's not retreating in resentment or waiting for him to notice her absence with bitterness in her heart. She's centered. Can, she's not afraid that the connection will die if she doesn't constantly tend to it, because she knows that a real connection doesn't need to be babysat. It needs to be respected. And sometimes respect looks like trusting the space between people to reveal the truth of the bond. If he leans in, it's because he wants to. If he doesn't, Can, it tells her everything she needs to know. Either way, she wins, not because she got what she wanted, but because she honored what she needed. Can, this ability to hold space without controlling the outcome is a form of emotional mastery. It means she's not reacting from her wounds. Can, she's not using her fear of abandonment to dictate her behavior. She's using her awareness of emotional patterns to guide her decisions. She's secure enough in herself to not panic in the pause, because that pause, that space, is where everything becomes clear. The avoidant either begins to engage from a more authentic place, Can, or he continues to distance, and both outcomes are valuable data. This woman isn't afraid of what the space will reveal because she's not afraid to face the truth. She doesn't use space to test him. She uses it to protect her peace. The beauty of space is that it creates contrast. When someone is always available, always responsive, always present, the mind starts to normalize it. But when there's a rhythm, presence followed by absence, connection followed by stillness, the emotional experience becomes more dynamic. It becomes felt. The avoidant, who's used to disconnecting as a form of self-protection, suddenly finds himself missing something. And that missing isn't born from manipulation. It's born from authenticity. Can, because she didn't try to force desire, she allowed it to build in the silence. Can, self-worth is not something you declare in front of a mirror once and magically believe for the rest of your life. It's something you embody moment by moment in the way you speak, the way you respond, the way you choose. A woman in her 30s or 40s who's done the work no longer waits for a man to validate her value. She doesn't need him to choose her in order for her to feel chosen. That need has been replaced by something far more powerful, identity. And that identity is not shaped by attention or affection. It's rooted in how she sees herself when no one's watching. She knows who she is, and that quiet knowing creates a kind of gravitational pull that's far more compelling than any strategy or technique. When an avoidant man meets a woman like this, he feels the difference immediately. She's not trying to impress him. She's not overly invested in managing his perception of her. She's not performing confidence. She lives it. Can, and because she doesn't need him to affirm her worth, she interacts with him from a place of abundance, not lack. That alone shifts the entire dynamic. Avoidants often operate with subtle control. They give just enough to keep someone hooked, but not enough to create real security. But when that tactic is met with someone who isn't chasing crumbs, it loses its power. She doesn't light up just because he shows intermittent interest. She's not hooked on potential. She's not mistaking inconsistency for mystery. Her standards don't lower just because the chemistry is strong. She doesn't confuse emotional intensity with emotional availability. This woman knows the difference between being wanted and being respected. She doesn't just want to be desired. She wants to be deeply understood, emotionally prioritized, and consistently supported. And she knows that if she accepts less, she teaches the other person how to treat her. So she doesn't tolerate hot and cold behavior. She doesn't settle for almost relationships or maybe dressed up as potential. She's not afraid to walk away, not because she doesn't care, but because she cares about herself enough not to stay where love is unclear. She's not waiting around hoping that her silence will provoke a response or that her presence will finally convince someone to choose her. She walks with dignity, and that dignity cannot be manipulated. Avoidants are drawn to strong, grounded women in ways they don't always understand. There's something about that calm certainty that stirs something in them. Part curiosity, part fear, part desire. They're used to emotional volatility. To partners who dance between anxious pursuit and emotional collapse. But now, here stands a woman who doesn't flinch when he pulls back, who doesn't collapse when he goes quiet. Who doesn't need to explain herself to feel seen. Her stillness becomes louder than his silence. Her confidence makes him feel seen in a way that's both thrilling and confronting. Because what she reflects back to him is his own inconsistency. And suddenly it's not attractive, it's exposed. And in that exposure, he's left with a choice: grow or lose her. This woman doesn't base her value on how someone treats her. She bases her choices on it. If someone shows her respect, presence, and effort, she opens her heart. If they don't, she protects it, not with walls, but with wisdom. She doesn't make excuses for behavior that falls short of her needs. She doesn't project potential onto patterns. She simply observes, evaluates, and acts. Her self-worth is not reactive. It doesn't spike when someone gives her attention or crash when they withdraw. It's steady. And that steadiness becomes the emotional foundation of everything she builds, especially in relationships. Avoidants often test boundaries without realizing it. They delay replies. They avoid tough conversations. They disappear when things get emotionally intense. But when they do that with this kind of woman, they don't meet chaos, they meet clarity. She doesn't respond with accusations or emotional outbursts. She responds with truth. And sometimes that truth comes in the form of silence. Sometimes it comes in the form of distance. Sometimes it comes in the form of goodbye, but it always comes from self-worth. She knows that the right person won't need to be chased, fixed, or decoded. The right person will meet her with the same level of emotional honesty she brings to the table. She's not afraid of being alone, not because she's numb to connection, but because she knows that solitude with peace is better than a relationship filled with anxiety and confusion. She's created a life that she actually enjoys, one that isn't waiting to be completed by a man. So when she dates, she's not dating from emptiness, she's dating from fullness. That fullness allows her to attract differently. It means she doesn't overlook red flags, doesn't glamorize the chase, doesn't internalize rejection. She knows that her value doesn't increase when someone wants her more, and it doesn't decrease when someone walks away. Her self-worth is hers. It's not up for negotiation, not up for debate, and definitely not up for sale.